On July 29th, Lieutenant Joji Yamashita returned to Leh after a patrol over Buna with news that stirred the entire base. It had been attacked for the first time by American carrier aircraft. He informed Lieutenant Commander Nakajima and Captain First Rank Saito that his 9 Zeros had encountered a mixed group of SBD, Dauntless SBD, dive bombers and F-4F Wildcat fighters, led by P-39 land-based fighters. Yamashita assumed they had flown in from Rabi, and American carrier aircraft made their first appearance in our theatre. The report that an American aircraft carrier had moved into the New Guinea area was ominous, and our staff officers became alarmed. If the Americans had managed to assign aircraft carriers to operations against our forces at Leh, Buna and Rabaul, it meant that there was some truth to their claims of victory at Midway, and to their denial of major losses in the Coral Sea battle. If Tokyo's statements were correct, and our fleet destroyed the aircraft carriers encountered in the Coral Sea and at Midway, where did this aircraft carrier come from? Something was not right here. And for the first time we questioned the veracity of the constant relay from Tokyo of continuous victories. However, most of the fighter pilots at Leh met this news with the exact opposite sentiment. Later that evening we pelted Yamashita pilots with questions. How many carrier planes had they encountered? Are the Wildcats better than the P-39s and P-40s? Do the American carrier pilots perform well? The answers were encouraging. Yamashita pilots claimed to have reliably shot down 3 dive bombers, 5 fighters, and 1 P-39 without losing a single aircraft. After that it became irrelevant what happened in the Coral Sea, at Midway and elsewhere. We all remembered very well that we had already been shooting down American fighters and bombers time after time for 4 months in a row, so the appearance of seaplanes only meant the possibility of additional victories. But for the next 3 days no new enemy planes appeared over Buna. On July 30th, 9 B-17s attacked the bridgehead and achieved serious success. Our 9 fighters managed to shoot down only 1 bomber from the enemy group. I got confirmation of the victory when I intercepted the 4th fortress over Cape Nelson and concentrated all cannon and machine gun fire on its nose. Apparently the pilot and co-pilot were killed because the huge plane dived into the sea, losing control. It was one of the hardest air battles ever fought, because when I got back to Leh, it turned out that several inches of skin on my right arm had been torn off by the bomber's machine gun burst. I missed death by literally a hair, and my mechanics had to labour all night to patch dozens of holes in the fuselage and wings. But on August 2nd, all American seaplanes went out of our minds. On that day an event happened which all Japanese fighter pilots could only dream of, and which we of course remembered forever. We were circling over Buna at 12,000 feet when we spotted 5 tiny specks a few miles away from the beachhead. The planes were flying at our altitude, and from the looks of it, they were fortresses. I flew up to Sasai's plane, and pointed to the approaching bombers. He nodded and pointed out the B-17s to the rest of the pilots. We continued circling in place in the same formation until the 4 engines of each bomber were visible. Sasai then signaled for us to follow him. He raised his right arm and shook his wings, ordering us to reorganize from wedges into a single column for a frontal attack. Our outboard tanks tumbled through the air. At last we had a chance to actually test our theories developed during the evening meetings in the barracks. We would soon find out whether or not the flying fortresses were vulnerable to a frontal attack. The situation was perfect. 9 Zero fighters met 5 huge B-17s, with Japan's best aces as part of that 9. Sasai led the attack. Oto was 500 yards behind his plane, followed by Endo. I occupied the 4th position, also 500 yards away, and my wingmen Yamakawa and Hattori followed numbers 5 and 6 in the column. Nishizawa flew 7th, followed by Takatsuka, and closing the column was Naval Aviator 3rd Class Yoshiosuyo. The 9 Zeros stretched in a column 4,000 yards long and carried in their cockpits the best pilots raised in Japan. As we approached, the fortresses closed formation. Sasai's fighter descended below the lead bomber and then hollowed out, slowly dovetailing to aim for the lower part of the bomber's forward cockpit. In the next second shots flashed and soon he completed the approach. Smoke billowed from all 5 bombers, but it was the smoke of shots from their own 1.2.7mm machine guns. the enemy formation did not break. Then Ota made his approach, exactly mirroring Sasai's actions. I followed his glowing trails, which rushed into the lead bomber. Then the wing of Ota's fighter wing bucked upward as he began to turn away. And then a tremendous explosion shook all the planes in the air. The brightest flash flashed in the sky, and a huge cloud of smoke appeared. The shock wave perceptibly shook my fighter, which was half a mile from the epicenter. One B-17 was gone. It disappeared, shattered into molecules as its bomb load exploded after being hit by Ota's shells. It was the most spectacular victory I had ever seen. I screamed loudly as Ota's fighter candled upward through the smoke. Endo now executed his approach, first diving and then taking off at a slight angle. Zero rocked smoothly, flying toward the bombers, his guns and machine guns spewing flames. But his lines passed him by, and Endo himself candled upward as the bomber's gunners took him in the crossfire. Now it was my turn. I gently pulled the control stick toward me, and the third fortress in the formation began to slowly grow in my sights. Closer, closer. I pressed the throttle. Nothing happened. The bomber filled the entire sky in front of me before I realized where I had gone wrong. You idiot. I forgot to take the safety off. That's the kind of mistake the greenest rookie wouldn't make. It was unbelievable. But I had to turn away sharply because the fortress was no more than 20 yards away. Their gunners had me in the crossfire. The Zeros shuddered as the bullets began hammering on the fuselage. I could literally feel the pieces of lead tearing through the plating. I flipped the fighter belly up and shoved the handle to the left, making a turn. I sped away, albeit a little battered. I was cursing my own stupidity now, but it was too late. I had wasted one run. I dropped under the enemy formation and turned on the engine afterburner to get ahead of the bombers for another run. Nishizawa, meanwhile, was strafing his B-17 from altitude. He controlled the plane perfectly. The fighter went up in a graceful arc, gradually turning as the distance decreased. The attack was perfectly executed, and Nishizawa put a line into the wing tank. Suddenly, flames engulfed the wing and quickly travelled onward. In a matter of seconds, the fortress became a flying ball of fire. Tongues of flame fluttered on the wings, twisted along the fuselage. The airplane jerked sharply and pecked its nose. Then it was over. Another violent explosion flipped Nishizawa's fighter on its back, as if it were a toy, and tossed aside. The other bombers tilted under the impact of the shockwave. Now it was Sasai's turn again. He fired a burst at the third bomber from nose to tail. Sasai began firing at a range of 150 yards, and his shells moved slowly along the fuselage. The airplane tilted sharply to the right, losing control. I could see fire inside the fuselage, licking the pilot's cockpit and second turret. The B-17 spun and went down. It rocked and jerked, a sure sign that both pilots were dead. The flames grew stronger, and for the third time in 2 minutes a terrible rumble marked the death of another flying fortress. I could hardly believe my own eyes, and these were the very airplanes that had driven our pilots to despair with their invulnerability. And now 1, 2, 3, 3 loud explosions, and 3 fortress shattered into such small pieces that, in fact, there was nothing to fall down. The 2 surviving bombers had split up when I started my second run, so I suddenly saw a void right in front of me. I candled upward and spotted 2 B-17s scurrying off in different directions. One was racing toward the mountains, and the other turned into the open sea. I chased the airplane, which kept above the water. The B-17 rocked and wiggled every time I tried to send a long line into the pilot's cockpit or fuel tank. For some unknown reason, the pilot never dropped the bombs, so the airplane was severely hampered by the extra weight. I spun to gain speed, got under the bomber and turned toward its left wing. The B-17 was getting bigger and bigger, filling the scope. I opened fire and watched the shells explode on the left wing and on the fuselage as they sliced through the metal plating, advancing toward the bomb bay. And in the next instant, the whole world shuddered. A bright, scorching flash filled the sky, blinding me. A huge fist grabbed my Zero and tossed it somewhere to the side. My ears rang in my ears, and I felt my nose bleed. The 4th fortress is ready. and all of them were destroyed by their own bombs. Now there was only one plane left. Bomber rushed towards the mountains, and 80 chased him like small hounds, chasing a huge wild boar. They were straining to catch up with the B-17, which appeared to have gotten rid of the bombs and was gaining speed. The bomber's course was to pass directly in front of me, and I had a chance to intercept it before it reached the ground. My decision turned out to be a very good one. As soon as I turned and gave full throttle, I immediately spotted 3 Airacobras coming from the east, gliding over the water. Apparently they had flown in on the call of the stranded fortresses. They were closing in on the 80s chasing the last B-17s, who were unaware of the new enemy. These 3 P-39s began to gain altitude behind our excited pursuit pilots, and I in turn made a U-turn to attack the excited pursuing Americans. The first P-39 had already taken the trailing Zero in its sights when I fired a line into it from a gentle dive. The enemy pilot never knew what happened. My bullets and shells pierced the fuselage and the plane just disappeared. Only one wing remained, tumbling haphazardly through the air. My cannons notified the other Zeros of the danger, and immediately 2 fighters performed a steep spiral and crashed into the Airacobras. It all took a matter of seconds. I recognized the planes of our incomparable aces Nishizawa and Ota. Each pilot gave a single, albeit long, burst and both Airacobras burst into flames. 3 enemy pilots attacked a Japanese group 3 times their size. Too bad their skill did not match their courage. However, we still had unfinished work to do. The single fortress now turned away from the shore and headed out to sea again. Her speed had decreased markedly. Therefore, it was only a matter of time before we would get the bomber with damaged engines. I had barely completed the long climb after diving on the Airacobra when a B-17 appeared right in front of my nose. It was too sudden and I didn't have time to aim, but I still fired a long burst. The shells flew away, and I turned around and began the approach for a second attack. The damaged fortress continued to snapping stubbornly. I was gaining altitude behind the bomber, watching the machine gun trails that curved through the air toward me, when suddenly the Zero shook terribly. It was as if hundreds of hammers were pounding on the iron, and someone started throwing me around the cockpit. My right arm went numb. The Zero bounced awkwardly and flipped belly up, then flew toward the sea, losing control. I glanced apprehensively at the dashboard, but the engine kept humming steadily. No fire and no smoke. I breathed a sigh of relief as I prepared to jump out of the cockpit. The burning Zero was not in the habit of flying too long in its assembled form. I was less than 1,000 feet above the water when I managed to get the fighter out of a haphazard descent. The airplane took a massive amount of damage, but the engine and controls were intact. As I brought the machine back to normal, I looked at my right arm. A piece of metal was sticking out of the glove on the back of my palm. I had clearly been lucky today. The jagged piece of plating had been ripped out by a bullet, but its too low velocity had saved me from a serious wound. Meanwhile, the fortress was steadily losing altitude, dragging a long tail of white smoke behind it. Zero pursued the bomber in a long column, alternately dive on it and release their turn. Suddenly, one fighter separated from the pack tormenting the B-17. He smoothly turned saucer and began to gradually descend, flying toward the shoreline. Behind it stretched a thin white stream. From the looks of it, the airplane had not sustained any serious damage, as it was flying perfectly straight. However, it was losing speed and altitude. I turned and glanced at the bomber, which was rapidly descending toward the water, seemingly having lost control. The next time I looked at the separated Zero, it was gone. At Leh, we got a standing ovation when we told the mechanics that we had destroyed 5 flying fortresses. People jumped and screamed with joy when they learned the details. 5 fortresses and 3 Airacobras a great day. Nishizawa landed 7th. He climbed out of the cockpit, ignoring the enthusiastic shouts of the ground staff. He asked only one question, "Where is Tsuyoshi?" and all at once everyone fell silent. "Where is my wingman?" Nishizawa asked. Takama TSU climbed out of his fighter and approached Nishizawa in silence. "Has nothing been transmitted from Salamawa? What's wrong with all of you? Doesn't anyone know anything?" shouted Nishizawa. It was as if he had become furious. There hadn't been a single radiogram from Salamaua, and no one had seen Tsueyoshi's fighter after it had turned toward the shore. "Refuel my plane and load the guns," ordered Nishizawa. We tried to persuade him not to go on an obviously hopeless search, but Nishizawa was undeterred. 2 hours later he returned, and despair was written all over his face. Tsueyoshi, one of our most beloved young pilots, was gone. The day of victory took on a flavor of bitterness for us. On August 3rd, most of the fighters that had been transferred to Leh were recalled to Rabaul. We rejoiced at this, for the redeployment promised a vacation from our daily patrols over Buna and an escape from night bombing. We threw all our belongings into Leh, firmly believing that we would soon be back. But we were wrong. We spent the first 4 days in Rabaul, flying to Rabi for reconnaissance and hunting. Soon this airfield turned into a veritable hornet's nest, where, as in Port Moresby, enemy fighters swarmed. When I came to my senses, I had the sky in front of me. Someone was shaking and tugging me. I turned around and recognized Sasasai and Nakajima. These officers had climbed onto the Zero's wing and were pulling me out of the cockpit. Nishizawa's voice broke through the muttering of the gathered crowd. "The car, quick," he shouted. Then he turned on the residents, "Quick, to the operating room. Call the chief surgeon. Quick, you sons of bitches." I couldn't go to the hospital. Not yet, anyway. First of all, I must report to Captain First Rank Sato. We always went to the command post and made a report. The need to give the report stuck in my brain like a splinter. I raised my right hand, demanding that Sasai and Nishizawa put me down. I whispered, "I have to give a report." "Send me to the command center," Nishizawa bellowed in response to "hell with duty. You can't wait around. We're taking you to the hospital." I stubbornly shouted that I had to give my report. The next moment, Nishizawa stepped forward and took me under his arm. Ota supported me from the left, and the two of them dragged me to the command center. Nishizawa continued to grumble, "Stupid bastard. You don't even know what you look like. You're just crazy." I don't remember how I ended up in front of Captain First Rank Saito, who was looking at me like a ghost. Standing 492, I struggled and tried to say something, but then the blackness came again. I suddenly felt like sleeping again. Just this. Sleep. What am I doing here? And then darkness again. Nishizawa and Ota dragged me into a car parked near the command post. They told me about it later. Nishizawa kicked the chauffeur out of his seat and got behind the wheel himself. He drove the car to the hospital quickly, but carefully, trying to avoid strong jolts. Sasai and Ota sat in the back seat with me and supported me. The senior surgeon was already waiting for me in the operating room. He cut off my tattered flight uniform and immediately began treating the wounds. Through my sleep, I felt horrible jabs of pain every now and then as the doctor cut into my scalp. He pulled 2 crumpled 2.7mm bullets out of my skull, which he showed me later. I could feel the knife scraping across my skull. I woke up when he was almost done. I looked up at him as he leaned over me. My eyes. And then I remembered my eyes. Suddenly panic gripped me, and I screamed my eyes. "Doctor, what's wrong with my eyes?" He replied, "You are seriously injured, and there is nothing more I can do here." He examined my face carefully. "You will have to be sent to Japan, where you will be taken care of by specialists." A premonition of disaster overwhelmed me. I feared for my right eye. I couldn't see anything with it. The thought that I might go blind horrified me. I would be completely useless as a fighter pilot. But I must fly. I just have to get back in the cockpit of a fighter plane. I spent 4 days in the hospital, which dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. Bandages covered my body. The doctor pulled 4 pieces of shrapnel out of me, not counting the bullets that pierced my head. On the 4th day, I felt that I could move my left arm and legs slightly. Muscles barely contracted, 493, but still they were already moving. But on the other hand, in the high tropical humidity, the wounds on my head became inflamed, and the right eye remained blind. Meanwhile, fighter and bomber sorties to Guadalcanal continued uninterrupted. Every day I heard the roar of the engines as the planes sped down the runway and flew away to the battlefield. The flying fortresses made daily visits to Rabaul. From a great height, they bombed our 2 airfields. Every time enemy bombers approached, I was taken to the shelter with other patients. Every night I was visited by Sasai and Nakajima. They suggested that I return to Japan. Only the cool climate of the homeland and the best specialists could heal my wounds, they insisted. I refused. I became irritable and capricious. I argued that I could be cured here in Rabaul, and there was no reason why I should not be able to fly again in a few weeks. If only I had known. It is difficult to explain my feelings, my reluctance to leave Rabaul. I realize now that I was on the verge of hysteria, because the nightmare of the end of my flying career loomed before me. Besides, there was still the question of honor. I considered it an honor to stay in Rabaul as long as possible. Even if I couldn't fly, I could help the green pilots. I could teach them, prevent them from making mistakes that could cost lives. All these reasons merged into one. My return to Japan meant the final verdict of the qualified ophthalmologist I so feared, and so I refused as best I could. Sasai and Nakajima gave up persuading me. It all came to an end on the morning of August 11th, when Captain First Rank Sato, commander of the Lei Air Regiment, came to my bedside. He spoke to me as kindly as possible, but was absolutely firm. 494. I know how you feel, but I must consider all available factors. I have ordered you to be sent to Japan on a rotational basis, and there you will be placed in the naval hospital at Yokosuka. You'll fly tomorrow on a transport plane. The surgeon told me that your only hope is the doctors in Yokosuka. He smiled at me. You're going home, not just for your own sake, but for ours as well, Sakai. We all know that you won't be treated better anywhere than in Japan. He rose to his feet. He stared at me for a few seconds, then bent down and patted my shoulder. You've done a great job, Sakai. Everyone who has only flown with you is proud to have known you and fought alongside you. When your wounds heal, come back to us, he said affectionately, and left. In the evening, Sasai came to see me. He was visibly tired from his daily sorties to Guadalcanal. I told him that orders had been received to send me home in the next few days. Soon all my friends gathered for a modest farewell party. No one sang or talked loudly, and there were no jokes. We just talked quietly, and mostly about Japan. But the Americans had no intention of letting us say goodbye quietly. We intended to sit quietly for a couple hours, but instead we had to run headlong into the shelters. The other pilots pulled me out of the hospital. I gritted my teeth in shame and bitterness. To be so helpless. Here were the men I had led into battle, and now they were dragging me on their backs, half blind and crippled. I wanted to cry and scream, to tear the bandages off. But all I could do was lie quietly with my eyes tightly shut. Early the next morning I made my way to the pier. There was a barge waiting to take me to a flying boat anchored in the bay. Along with me went Sasai, and the rest of the pilots had gathered. 495. Sasai shook my hands firmly. I am sorry to part with you, Saburo. Much more than you can imagine. Tears ran down my cheeks. I just couldn't hold them back. My throat constricted and I could only shake his hand in response. Releasing his hands, Sasai unbuckled his belt and handed it to me. I stared at the buckle engraved with the roaring tiger. Saburo, this belt was handed to me by my father. I have one, my relatives have 2 more. One of us has already died. I know little of the magical properties of the silver tiger, but I want you to keep this buckle and wear it in memory of me. I hope it will help you return to us. I protested, but in vain. Sasai was undeterred. He put the belt and buckle in my pocket, then shook hands again. I'll see you again, Saburo. I'm not saying goodbye. We'll meet again, and hopefully very soon. He helped me down into the barge. She immediately ploughed on to the waiting airplane. Nishizawa, Ota, Yamakawa, Hattori, Nakajima, and all my friends were waving at me from the pier. They were shouting for me to come back soon, to fly with them again. But then they all seemed to melt away. I could still see with my left eye no farther than a few feet away. I stood as straight as I could and waved at them with my right hand as they turned into vague, blurry silhouettes. and then I cried like a baby. There were very few passengers in the flying boat. Me, a resident who was to care for me on the trip home, and a few war correspondents. Along the way we stopped for refueling at Truk and Saipan. It had been a very long time since I had last been home. I had no idea what wartime Japan was like, but I was still 496 totally unprepared for what I saw at Yokohama. We landed in the harbour on Saturday evening. There was not much point in going to the hospital at night, so I went into town. There I could catch a cab and stop by my uncle, who lived on the west side of Tokyo. The people, they had absolutely no idea what war was really like. I looked in amazement at the bustling crowds, the bright lights and glowing windows. I could not believe what I was hearing with my own ears. Thousands of voices, carefree laughter. Did they have no idea what was really going on in the Pacific Southwest? Before each news bulletin thundered down the street, the radio broadcast the Navy march, and then the announcer jubilantly reported the colossal victories over the Americans in the air battles in the Solomon Islands. I heard an absolutely incredible list of American ships sunk, learned of hundreds of airplanes shot down. Crowds of people on the streets in light and bright summer clothes stopped outside stores and on corners where speakers hung. Each time the announcer reported a new major defeat of the enemy, the crowd cheered and triumphant shouts flew through the streets. The nation was simply intoxicated with false victories. People did not realize that there was a war of annihilation going on. I saw that only some delicacies were rationed in the stores. The weight necessary for ordinary life was sold absolutely freely. I wanted to leave this city quickly. Everything that was happening in Leh and Rabaul was beginning to seem unreal. How could these two completely different worlds exist at the same time? After all, blood and death are only a few hours away, and back home there are only shouts of joy over non-existent victories. I waved my hand to the chauffeur and gave him my uncle's address. We drove through Yokohama and found ourselves in Tokyo. But after 497 a few minutes, the car stopped a policeman and looked through the window, staring at me suspiciously. He was confused by my tattered uniform, stained with blood, and the bandages on my head. "What happened to you?" he asked demandingly. "I have just returned to Japan from the front," I replied sourly. "Really?" exclaimed the policeman. "So you were wounded at the front? Where? Tell me where and how." I sighed. "I am a pilot from Guadalcanal. I was shot down in an air battle." Guadalcanal. The young policeman's eyes sparkled. "We heard about it on the news. And I know we just yesterday won a crushing victory over the Americans. The radio said our fleet sank 5 cruisers, 10 transports and 10 destroyers. It must have been a sight to behold." This was too much. I said rather sharply, "Sorry, Sergeant, but I'm running late. Come on and hurry up," I ordered the chauffeur. Many years have passed since the day I first set foot on the threshold of my uncle's house. The house itself hadn't changed a bit. It was as if it had come out of the distant past, 1,000,000 years ago. For a few minutes I stood on the sidewalk, admiring the familiar building, the lights and sounds. A strange sense of peace came over me. The irritation faded, and I opened the door, just as I had when I was a child, and uttered the same words as I had then. "It's me. I've come home." From the kitchen came a surprised "Who's there?" I smiled. It was my aunt. "It's me," I obediently replied. There was silence for a moment. "It's me. Saburo," I shouted joyfully. My uncle's voice boomed throughout the house. "What?" And they all ran into the hallway. For almost a minute they stared at me in silence. Uncle, aunt, my cousins and brother, Hatsuo and Michio. They could not 498 utter a word, just stood there with their mouths open. I waited patiently while they examined my bloody uniform and bandages. My uncle's voice suddenly sat down to an intermittent whisper. "Is it really you, Saburo?" I could barely hear what he said. "Is it really Saburo? Or is it a ghost in front of me?" Uncle gingerly stepped forward, as if he was afraid I might melt into thin air. I replied, "No, I'm not a ghost. I'm real. And I'm back home again." It was a real return to life. The battles, the death, the wounds, the crack of machine guns, the frantic turns, the American fighters, the dirty bomb shelters. Everything flew away, became unreal, distant, ghostly. It was as if this world no longer existed, though it still hung heavy on my shoulders, like the ghost my uncle had taken me for. To be home again. To talk to my uncle and aunt, to see Hatsuo and Michio again, to relax. To know for sure that there would be no bombing at night, that no flying fortresses were hovering overhead, that the engines of the Mitchells and Marauders would not roar, no explosions would rumble, no shrapnel would whistle, no machine gun bursts would crackle. It took me a long time to relax and forget. I shook my head more than once, trying to regain my senses. We had a lot to talk about. After all, it had been almost 3 years since I had spent the night together with this family. Hatsuo was no longer the schoolgirl I remembered. I stared at her, trying to convince myself that this beautiful young woman was really my cousin. Michio, the bully boy who had been in elementary school, had now moved on to high school, transforming into a nondescript young man. I continued to stare at Hatsuo, trying to catch all the changes that had happened to her over the years. I stayed the night at their house. It was the first night in many years that I had enjoyed a deep and restful 499 sleep. Even my wounds, which had prevented me from sleeping for the last week, did not bother me tonight. The next morning I took the train to Yokohama. The ordinary life of the people in this city seemed even more amazing to me than the night before. The passengers, especially the young girls and women, immediately stared at me. They were squeamish and turned away hastily. They purposely tried not to look at the bloody bandages, and it made me nervous and angry. I was no longer Lei and Rabal's best ace, the man Captain First Rank Sate had asked to return, the pilot respected by all the other pilots. I was bloody, dirty, and pathetic in appearance. I was simply despised. As soon as I arrived at the hospital in Yokosuka, an orderly immediately took me to the chief surgeon's office. I was puzzled because it was Sunday. On such days, barring very special occasions, the chief surgeon is simply absent. And he surprised me by meeting me in person. The doctor grinned, seeing my confusion, and explained I left orders to notify me immediately as soon as you show up. I have just arrived from home. You see, I received a special letter from Captain First Rank Saito of Lei. He asks me to do what I can for you. He looked at me carefully. Captain First Rank Saito took the trouble to tell me what you did in the Pacific. I understand you are our best ace fighter. I nodded. Oh. I fully understand your commander's concerns. Come on in, we'll start work immediately. A few minutes later, I was lying on the operating table. The surgeon was scraping pus from my head wounds. He worked quickly and carefully, not caring that I was twitching from the touch of the scalpel scraping across my skull. When he had cleaned the wounds and placed 14 new stitches, he personally took me to the ophthalmologists. 500. The surgeon explained we called the best specialist in Japan to examine you. Dr. Sakano, after private practice, was drafted into the Navy and now holds the rank of lieutenant captain. He is the best eye surgeon in our country. When we received Captain First Rank Sato's letter, we immediately informed Dr. Sakano that we would call on him upon your arrival. So, the fateful moment for me has arrived. I would soon find out what the verdict would be, whether I would see again, and whether I would be able to take to the air. I tried to think of anything but my eyes. I didn't want to think about them, but I couldn't. The doctor examined me carefully. He stood motionless for a few minutes and only then spoke. His face was serious, and he spoke very slowly. We cannot wait a moment. I must operate on your eyes at once. Listen to me carefully. Your sight will depend on what I manage to do in the next hour. He paused. Sakai, I will not be able to administer the anesthetic. If you want to see, if you wish for me to save at least one eye, you must prepare to endure the pain while fully conscious. I was shocked, so I obediently nodded, not daring to open my mouth. They laid me on a high bed. Several orderlies tied me down with straps and ropes. I couldn't move an arm or a leg. A bandage across my forehead held my head, and a nurse squeezed my temples to make the grip more secure. The doctor ordered me to stare at a red lamp hanging from the ceiling. He warned, "Look at her, Sakai. Keep your eyes on it. Don't take your eyes off that lamp. You must not blink, you must not look away. Listen to me carefully. You may go blind for life if you don't follow my instructions exactly." It was terrible. Much more terrible than it was then. It was the most terrible pain I ever had to 501 endure. I had always believed that I could endure great pain. The Bushido Code had taught me patience, self-control in the most dire circumstances. But this. I was forced to stare at the lamp, stared until the red bulb filled all around me. Then the doctor's hand appeared in my field of vision, trembling and unreal, with sharpened steel in its fingers, which came nearer, 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 nearer. I shrieked. More than once I had screamed like a madman in terrible agony. I felt that a little more, and I would not be able to stand it. But nothing happened, and the pain eventually subsided. My desire to fly again, my desire to see, meant nothing now. The pain. One day I yelled at Sakano, "Stop it, stop it. Rip it out completely, just stop it." I tried to pull my head away from the scalpel. I tried to break free from my restraints. However, they held me too tightly. Every time I moaned, the doctor yelled at me, "Stop it. You have to endure it. Otherwise you will remain blind. Stop moaning." The torture lasted more than 30 minutes, but they stretched out for me like a million years. It seemed to me that the suffering would never end. And when it was over, I was so weak I couldn't move a finger. I lay in bed, gasping for air, helpless as a child. It was only when the senior surgeon bent over me, trying to make me comfortable, that I groaned. For a month, I was confined to a hospital bed. I felt disgusting. Life no longer meant anything to me. Day and night I remembered the long flight back to Rabaul. And each time it ended the same way. I pushed the control stick forward and crashed into the ocean. For that would only mean a momentary bout of pain. Doctor. Sakano visited me often to check my eyes. He explained, "I did everything I could, but your right eye will never see normally. You 502 will be able to see objects a foot or two away, and no more. But your left eye will be perfectly all right." These words struck me like a thunderbolt. In fact, it was a death sentence. A one-eyed fighter pilot. I laughed hysterically, and the doctor hurried away. The wounds on my head healed quickly, and the doctors allowed me to walk around the hospital. Every week I petitioned to be reinstated and sent to Rabaul. And every week the request was rejected. Finally, the senior surgeon personally returned the last petition. He was visibly angry. "I must tell you, Sakai, that it will be many more months before you can even dream of returning to Rabaul. My orders are quite clear. You will need at least 6 months to recover from your wounds before you will be returned to active duty here, or in the overseas theatre." I felt like a fugitive, a deserter from the front. I thought of all the pilots, Nishizawa, Ota, Sasai, who every day on their Zeros go into another battle. I dreaded listening to the news from the fronts on the radio. They reminded me too painfully of Rabaul. One day I had visitors. The nurse came into the room and said, "You have visitors, they're waiting downstairs. Will you let them come in?" I had no idea who it could be. Today was Thursday, and my cousin Hatsuyu came to see me and brought flowers at the end of every week when she could get off work at her munitions factory. I wrote to my mother to tell her not to make the long trip from Kyushu because I was to be transferred to a hospital in Seispo in a couple of weeks. Yokosuka was separated from Fukuoka in northern Kyushu by nearly 700 miles by railroad. Mother was now living in Fukuoka with her daughter and son-in-law. But these visitors I was not expecting at all. 2 people entered the room. I strained to recognize them. 503, but I still could not distinguish faces at a distance of more than 6 or 7 feet. "Fujiko-san," I said her name. At the door stood Fujiko, even more beautiful than when we last met. Along with her was her father, Professor Nairi. I hadn't seen her in 18 months since our meeting in Osaka. They bowed to me and I returned their greeting. We continued to be silent. The nurse offered them chairs and went out. Then her father spoke. "Hatsuyu-san wrote to us that you were lying in this hospital. We were so worried about you, Saburo-san. We are greatly relieved to see you, as we feared greatly for your health. It is simply marvelous, for you are looking much better than we thought you would." I mumbled something in reply. The apology was inarticulate and confused, for Fujiko had written to me often when I was in Leh, and the mail had brought me many gifts from her. But her father waved his hand, brushing aside all objections. "It is of no consequence. We are all well aware of your marvelous deeds at the front, and we are proud of you. Now tell me, how are your wounds? Will you recover from them soon?" I replied, "I received 4 wounds. The doctors have done real miracles. Except for one." I bitterly pointed to my right eye. "I am blind in that eye, and the doctors say it is for the rest of my life." My answer horrified Fujiko. She brought her hands up to her mouth, her eyes going wide when she heard my words. "It's true, it's the gist of it I emphasized. There can be no other outcome. I have become an invalid. The loss of my eye means the end of my career as a fighter pilot." Professor Niori interrupted me, "But in that case you should be discharged from the Navy. Shouldn't you 504? No. No, I don't think so," I replied as sarcastically as possible. "Here at home you simply do not realize the full extent of the war we are fighting. But I don't think I can blame you for that. The Navy will find a use for me as an instructor. Maybe they'll pick me up some command position on land." There was a brief pause. Only now did I realize that these people had travelled over 500 miles from Tokushima just to see me, to support me, and to cheer me up. I had behaved shamefully, and after realizing this, I began to thank them for their kindness. Fujiko shook her head. She was disturbed by the dry politeness in my voice. She tried to say something, but her throat constricted and she fell silent. Finally, she turned to the older man and sobbed, "Daddy." There was a mute plea in her eyes. Professor Niori nodded slowly and coughed. "When are you thinking of going back to the Navy again?" he asked, looking me straight in the eye. "I think we should hurry up with the wedding preparations. Of course, if you agree, Saburo-san." What?" I choked up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The wedding preparations. I felt dizzy. "I'm sorry, did I understand you correctly?" I asked back. "I'm sorry, Saburo-san," he replied. "I realize it's awkward to put the question that way. Allow me to put it another way." He rose to his feet and asked in the utmost seriousness, "Saburo-san, do you agree to take my daughter Fujiko as your wife? We have done our best to raise her to be a worthy woman. We have taught her everything she needs to know. I would be extremely happy if you would accept my proposal so that I could call you my son-in-law." I was simply taken aback. His words sounded like heavenly bells. 505. Fujiko looked at me with wide-open, glittering eyes, then lowered her gaze. I tore my gaze away from her and stared at the wall. The bitter irony of it all. How many days had I been staring at that very wall in despair? Finally, I pulled myself together. I could barely speak, and the words were literally stuck in my throat. I had to push them out. I hated myself for what I had to say, but I had no other way. "Professor Niori, I'm extremely honored to hear your words. It's just a blessing, but—" I choked and blinked back tears. "But I can't. I can't accept your offer." "That's it," it said. I said the words. What his voice trailed off. "Are you not already married to someone else?" "No, of course not. I had no such thought. I beg your pardon. I must decline, but for an entirely different reason. Professor Naori, I simply cannot say yes. It's impossible. Look at me. Look at me. I don't deserve Fujiko-san. Look at my eyes. I've already screamed. I'm half blind after all." There was a visible look of relief on his face. "Oh my God, Saburo-san, you're humiliating yourself unnecessarily. Don't think you've gotten worse because you were wounded. Your wounds are honorable. They in no way dishonor you. Do you understand what I'm saying? All Japan admires you. People pray to you. Don't you realize that you are our country's greatest ace and a national hero?" "Professor Niori, there is no way you can understand me. I'm telling you the plain truth, And you just don't hear me, I insisted. I do not engage in self-deprecation. A hero is always transient. He's like a one-day butterfly. I'm not a hero. I'm a pilot who can't fly. I'm a half-blind pilot. That's what I am. What use am I in the 506 future? Yes, I'm a hero. But you know very well that in our country an individual cannot be a hero. He was silent for a while, and then continued, perhaps I have put it wrong, Saburo-san. But our decision was not made hastily and suddenly. My wife and I discussed everything right after our first meeting. I understand your feelings, but you must understand something too. My wife, myself, and Fujiko believe that you are the only man who can make her happy. And we believe, that our daughter will do the same for you. I felt my heart breaking. Did this noble and intelligent man not realize what I was getting at? How can you judge a man by a meeting? I shrieked. How can you make a decision knowing me so little? Fujiko-san's whole life, her happiness, her future, you are ready to tie it to me in an instant. I do not understand you. Though never in my life have I heard a proposal more noble and honorable than this. I clasped my hands in despair. After all, there are many other young men who are far better suited for Fujiko-san than I am. Thousands of young men. They have excellent educations, brilliant futures awaiting them. What can I offer your daughter, Professor Nyori? What can I give her? I beg you, look on the bright side. Look at me. What future awaits me? Fujiko couldn't stay silent any longer. She raised her head and looked directly at me. I felt like jumping out of the room. She said quietly, "You're wrong, Saburo-san." "Oh, how wrong you are. You put too much importance on the lost eye. Whether you are blind in one eye or not is irrelevant to me. We'll live as one person. Whatever lies ahead for any man awaits you. If it is necessary, Saburo-san, only if it is necessary, I will help. But I'm not going to marry you just because of your corrupted vision 507. I replied, "You are mistaken, Fujiko-san. I know you are a brave girl, and what you say of yourself is pure truth. But you cannot determine your entire future life by giving in to a momentary emotion." No, she shook her head vigorously. "How can you misunderstand me to that extent? This is not a transient infatuation. Don't you realize that I have been waiting many months for this meeting? I know what I am saying." There was no point in continuing this conversation any farther. I feared that I might break down at any moment. "Professor Nyori and Fujiko-san," I said, putting as much firmness into my voice as I could. "I'm not trying to humiliate you in any way. And this is not an attempt to bargain. I repeat that today you have honored me in ways I never dared to expect. But I cannot accept your honorable offer. I refuse to let my feelings override my reason. I have always been a proud man. I cannot marry Fujiko-san. I can't be the husband of such a girl. I'm not worthy of such a high honor. I don't deserve it. It is for this reason that I am forced to say no." I refused to listen to the professor's words. He begged me, but I could only repeat what I had already said, repeat it once more. Soon Fujiko couldn't take it any more. She fell on her father's shoulder and sobbed loudly. I was ready to kill myself for what I had done. I felt so sorry for her. But I knew that I was doing the right thing, though cruel, and that I was doing it for her own good. Marrying me might bring her temporary happiness, but later Fujiko would be doomed to suffer for years. After about an hour, they left my room. I don't know how long I stood in the doorway after they left. Then I turned around and collapsed on my bed, completely exhausted. It was the hardest hour of my life. But what else could I do? Thousands of times I had asked myself that question. And thousands of times I got the same answer. 508. There was no other way out, but that didn't make me feel any better. I had pushed away the most beautiful man I had ever met. 2 days later, Hatsuo arrived for her weekly visit. She didn't greet me with her usual smile, and didn't even try to hide her displeasure. "How could you do that, Saburo?" she asked, taking a seat at my bedside. "How dare you hurt Fujiko so badly?" Hatsuo said that Fujiko sobbed inconsolably when she met Hatsuo in Tokyo after returning from the hospital. Professor Niori asked my uncle and Hatsuo to do their best to get me to change my mind. Hatsuo looked at me angrily. They say, Saburo, that you did that because they were upset when they learned of your injury. Father and I have known this family for a long time. They are wonderful people. Why did you do that? She cried. Hatsuo, please try to understand me. We've lived together as children for several years, and I suppose you know me well too. As much as it pains me to listen to you, there's no way I'm going to change my mind. I honestly think I am doing this for Fujiko's good, for her happiness. She immediately objected. They say you refused because you were hurt. You shouldn't say that. That is only one of the reasons. I immediately fell deeply in love with Fujiko after the first time we met. My feelings have not cooled in the slightest, and I still love her deeply today. All those long months in Leh and Rabol, well, Fujiko was the woman of my dreams. Can't you understand that? I refused because I love her. You're just crazy, Saburo. Then hear me out. All the time I was at the front, all those long, tedious months, I remembered her every minute. I wanted to make her proud of me, and I have achieved that. 509. It's probably not the most pleasant thing to discuss with you, but I have to be honest. Rabol is a large military base that has always had a garrison of over 10,000 soldiers. In addition, an additional infantry division was often stationed there. And what do you think men do when they are far from home, far from their women? In Rabol we had brothels, as they have here in Yokosuka. When we went back to Rabol on vacation, some of our pilots just wouldn't get out of those brothels. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But I never did that. My pride wouldn't let me. I wanted to stay as pure as Fujiko on the day I would ask her to be my wife. Before my injury, I could return to her as Sakai, a great ace, a fearless pilot, a man deserving of her hand. But now? No. I've already yelled at Hatsuo. I don't want to be pitied. Do you really think I'd let Fujiko pity me?
Never.
Do you understand me now? Hatsuo squeezed my hand tightly and nodded. I know was all she whispered. Then she looked me straight in the eyes. And I also know, Saburo, that you are far better than even you can imagine yourself. I know how much you want to fly, and yet I can't stop feeling sorry for Fujiko. It's what's best for her. But Hatsuo interrupted me, wrapping her arms around my neck and pressing herself tightly against me. Poor Saburo. You have to hope. You must have faith. You will fly again. I know you will. On August 8th, we received orders from the command post to fly out on patrol and slowly walked across the airfield to our fighters. Most of the 18 pilots had already taken their seats in the fighter cockpits when the ordinaries came rushing in and yelled that the flight was cancelled. We were ordered to reconvene at the command post. There was unbelievable turmoil. Ordinaries and messengers were darting back and forth. The anxious officers were no slower. Lieutenant Captain Nakajima, who was to command today's flight, came out of the Admiral's office very angry and yelled at us, "Today's flight is cancelled. We will get another assignment." He ran his gaze around the room. Where did that resident go? Hey you, give me the map quickly, he barked at the dazed messenger. Nakajima unfolded the map on the large table and began plotting a course. He leaned over the map, paying no attention to the pilots. I asked LT. Sasai if he knew what had happened. Sasai asked Nakajima, who mumbled something briefly and ran off to the Admiral's office without saying a word to us. He returned a few minutes later and ordered the pilots to come closer. His words sounded like a bomb bursting. At 0520 this morning, a large enemy force landed a landing at Lunga, on the southern tip of Guadalcanal Island. Initial reports indicate that the Americans have moved huge numbers of men and weapons to the island. At the same time, they attacked Tulagi on the island of Florida. Our flying boat flotilla has been completely destroyed. As soon as the commander works out a route, we will immediately fly to Guadalcanal to attack the enemy forces near the bridgehead. The ordinaries distributed maps of the island to all the pilots. We looked at them, searching for the completely unfamiliar island that had suddenly become so important. The men muttered something in a low voice. One pilot exclaimed in despair, "Where the hell is this damn island? Has anyone even heard of it?" We measured the distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and whistled in amazement. 560 miles. We would have to fly that distance to an enemy beachhead, engage enemy fighters, and then fly the same distance back. The distance was impressive. We had 1,100 miles to fly there and back, and this did not take into account combat with the enemy or unfavorable weather, which forced additional fuel consumption. When we realized this, all talk quieted down on its own. We waited in silence for the commander to give new orders. Ordinaries one after another ran into the admiral's office with new reports from the battle area. We heard one messenger inform Nakajima that communication with Tulagi had been lost and the garrison had been killed to the last man. Sasai turned pale upon hearing this. I asked him several times if everything was all right. Finally he answered quietly, "Looking straight ahead, my son-in-law served in Tulagi. It was clear that he had accepted the inevitable, and was speaking of his sister's husband in the past tense. If Tulagi is occupied by the enemy, his son-in-law, Lieutenant Captain Yoshio Toshiro, a flying boat pilot, is no longer among the living." Nakajima repeated the order, "You will have to make the longest fighter flight in history. Do not try to catch random chances today. Strictly adhere to orders. Do not wiggle sideways or waste fuel. All pilots who run out of fuel on the way back from Guadalcanal must make an emergency landing on Buka Island. Our troops on the island have been instructed to do so and will post observers to watch our planes. Keep in mind that flying to Guadalcanal and returning to Buka means about the same distance as flying from Tainan to Clark Air Base in the Philippines and returning. I'm pretty sure you can fly that distance with no problem. The return is an entirely different issue. You will be able to return, but there may be difficulties. So I'll repeat my warning, don't waste fuel." As soon as we received the order, the pilots broke into threes. I told my wingmen Yamakawa and Hattori, "Today is the first time you will meet American naval pilots. They will have a marked advantage over us considering the distance we have to fly. I want you to exercise extreme caution in all your actions. Also, do not, under any circumstances, leave my side. Whatever happens around you, stay as close to my plane as possible. Remember, under no circumstances do not break away." We ran to the planes and waited for the runway to clear. 27 Betty bombers took off in front of us. Then Lieutenant Captain Nakajima waved his hand in the cockpit. By 0830, all the fighters were in the air. Ground personnel, and those pilots who were not flying that day lined both sides of the runway, waving caps and shouting good luck wishes. The weather was beautiful, especially over Rabaul. Even the volcano had fallen silent. Its eruption had ended in June, and now there was only a thin trickle of smoke billowing from the crater to the west. We took up our position just behind the bombers. I was surprised to notice that the Betty was carrying bombs instead of torpedoes, which were usually used to attack ships. The bombs angered me, as I knew full well how difficult it was to hit a moving target from high altitude. Even the B-17s, despite their amazing marksmanship, had wasted huge numbers of bombs when attacking ships in Boone. We slowly gained altitude, and then turned east toward Buka Island, keeping 13,000 feet above the sea. About 60 miles south of Rabaul, I spotted a particularly beautiful islet in the sea. It was horseshoe-shaped and covered in bright green. This atoll was labelled on our charts as Green Island. At that moment I had no idea that this colourful atoll would later save my life. Above Buka, our group turned and flew south along the west coast of Bougainville. The sun was warming pleasantly through the glass of the lantern. Gradually I was getting soaked. Since it was still quite a long time before we encountered the enemy, I pulled a bottle of soda from the ration box. Without thinking about anything, I opened it. I had completely forgotten about the altitude. As soon as I pulled the cork, the soda fountained from the neck. In a matter of seconds, the sticky liquid flooded all around me. Fortunately, the strong draft in the cabin dried everything up in no time. But the sugar dissolved in the soda had settled on my glasses, and now I couldn't see a thing. Cursing my stupidity, I started scrubbing the glasses. I could barely see anything around me anyway. I spent the next 40 minutes desperately trying to wipe not only the glasses, but also the windshield and instruments. I had never felt so stupid before. My fighter fell out of commission as I rubbed all over the place, slowly boiling over with anger. By the time I could see normally in all directions, we were over Velia La Vela, halfway between Rabaul and Guadalcanal. Over New Georgia, we gained altitude and flew at 20,000 feet over the Russell Islands. About 50 miles ahead, Guadalcanal began to rise out of the water. Even from this distance, I could see flashes of yellow fire over the island. It looked like a serious battle was brewing between the Zero fighters from the other bases and the American planes defending the landing. I looked down at the northern coast of Guadalcanal. In the strait between Guadalcanal and Florida, hundreds of white lines, the kielvator jets of enemy ships, crossed the sea in every direction. Ships were swarming literally everywhere. I had never seen so many warships and transports at once. And it was the first time I'd ever seen an American landing operation. It was hard to believe. I made out at least 70 ships heading toward shore and a dozen destroyers embroidering white lace on the water around them. There were other ships visible on the horizon, but they were too far away to distinguish and count them. Meanwhile, the bombers slowly lay down on a combat course. Straight ahead of them at 13,000 feet, small clouds floated at an altitude of 13,000 feet. The sun was to our right and above us, its blinding glow making it difficult to see that part of the horizon. I felt uncomfortable. We would not be able to spot the fighters attacking from this direction. Soon my fears became a reality. Quite suddenly, 6 fighters emerged from that glow. At a glance, it was noticeable that they had thicker fuselages than any American aircraft we had encountered so far. They were painted olive green and the underside of the wings were white. Wildcats, the first F-4 I encountered. The Wildcats, ignoring the Zeros, swarmed toward the bombers. Our fighters rushed after them, opening fire from long range, hoping to at least distract the enemy. But Wildcatty crashed into the line of bombers, turned over the wing and fled diving. The bombers dropped their cargo on a large convoy near Savo Island. I watched the bombs make a graceful curve as they went down. Over the sea, gushing geysers exploded, but the enemy ships moved on unperturbed. It was obvious folly to try to hit the oncoming ships from 4 miles up. I could not understand why torpedoes, which had proved so effective in attacking ships many times in the past, were not used. All our efforts went to waste within a few seconds of totally inaccurate bombing. The group of bombers turned left and began to pick up speed, heading back to Rabaul. We escorted them to Russell Island, where they were no longer threatened by enemy fighters, and turned back toward Guadalcanal. It was about 1:30 p.m. 18 Zeros, ready for combat, flew over Lunga Point. Again, using the blinding sun as cover, the Wildcats attacked our planes. I was the only pilot who saw them dive for the attack. So I immediately lifted my fighter plane candle up, and the rest of the planes followed. Again, the Wildcats scattered and flew in different directions. This attempt at evasion was puzzling, as no one gained anything as a result. Apparently, the Americans were in no mood to fight today. I looked back to see if my wingmen were still there. They were gone. Apparently, things had gotten more complicated than I thought. The enemy had decided to fight after all. I turned my head looking for Yamakawa and Hattori, but I didn't see them. Sasai's plane with 2 blue stripes on its fuselage was flying nearby, and several other Zeros were trying to join it, but not my wingmen. Finally, I saw them about 1,500 feet below me. A single Wildcat was chasing 3 Zeros, firing short bursts at the dodging Japanese planes. All 4 planes were spinning like mad in a tight left-hand spiral. The Zeros could have easily finished off the Wildcat, but every time a Japanese fighter took the enemy in its sights, it would turn away sharply and end up on the tail of the Zero again. I had never seen such piloting before. I shook the wings of my airplane to notify Sasai and spiked. The Wildcat was firmly hooked into the Zero's tail, its lines whipping across the wings and keel. In desperation, I fired a line. Wildcat immediately lay on the right wing, that made a turn and with a gain of altitude went straight at me. I had never seen an enemy plane move so swiftly and gracefully. Every second his machine guns were getting closer and closer to the belly of my fighter. I turned around, trying to shake him off. However, he did not flinch. The American was using my favorite tactic, coming up from below. I moved the throttle back, and the Zero shook as its speed plummeted. It worked. The dazed enemy pilot dropped the throttle as well. I immediately moved the throttle sector forward while simultaneously swerving to the left. I made 3 turns, then went into a corkscrew and finished with a left spiral. The Wildcat followed on my heels. Our left wings were at right angles to the sea surface, and our right wings were pointing straight up into the sky. Neither of us gained an advantage. We were spiraling, and the tremendous overloads were pressing us into our seats harder and harder with each passing second. My heart was racing, and my head felt like lead. A grey haze was gradually covering my eyes. I clenched my teeth tighter. If the enemy pilot can take it, so can I. The first pilot who couldn't take it and turned away would be the first to die. On the 5th spiral, the Wildcat took a slight tumble. I'm going to get him, I thought. But the American plane pecked its nose and picked up speed again. The pilot regained control of the plane. Yes, there was a scary man in the cockpit of the Wildcat. But in the next moment he made a mistake. Instead of entering the 6th spiral, he gave full throttle, turned sideways and began a dead loop. Here he lost a crucial fraction of a second. I turned right behind him, entered the inside of the Grumman turn, and was on his tail. I got him. He kept doing loops, trying to close the distance with each arc, but each time he went up and flipped, I would fit into his arc and get a little closer. In this maneuver, the Zero could outperform any fighter in the world. When I was 50 yards away, the Wildcat came out of the loop and surprised me by flying straight up horizontally. At that distance I didn't need a cannon. I fired about 200 bullets at the Wildcat's cockpit. I could see them pierce the thin aluminum plating and shatter the glass. But I couldn't believe what I saw. The Wildcat continued to fly as if nothing had happened. If the Zero had taken as many bullets, it would have been a ball of fire long ago. I didn't realize anything. I increased the throttle and caught up with the American fighter, but at that moment it lost speed. In a matter of moments I was 10 yards ahead of the Wildcat, trying to slow down too. I squeezed my head into my shoulders, expecting a machine gun burst in my back. Now I was caught. But no bullets came, and the Wildcat's machine guns were silent. The situation was simply impossible. I slowed down until the planes were level, and now we were flying wing to wing. I opened the lantern vent and looked out. The lantern of the Wildcat was already moved, and I could clearly distinguish the pilot. He was a large man with a round face. He was dressed in a light khaki uniform. He was a middle-aged man, not a young man, as I had expected. For a few seconds we flew together in this crazy formation. Our eyes met. The Wildcat was mangled. Bullet holes dotted the entire fuselage and wings. The rudder trim had been torn off, and the metal nerves stuck out like skeletal ribs. Only now did I realize why the American was flying horizontally and not firing. Blood covered his right shoulder and ran down his chest in a dark trickle. And despite being badly wounded, he was still keeping the plane in the air. I just could not raise my hand to kill this man. And I couldn't fly next to him either. I raised my left hand and shook my fist at him, shouting at him to fight instead of flying like a target in a drill. It was no use, though. The American was clearly surprised. He raised his right hand slightly and waved back. I have never felt so strange before. I had killed many Americans in the air, but this was the first time I had a man in front of me in such a helpless state from the wounds that I had been the one to inflict on him. I honestly admit I didn't know if I should finish him off or not. I realized that such thoughts were foolishness. Wounded or not, he was the enemy. He had nearly killed 3 of my comrades. However, there was no reason to aim for the pilot now. After all, I needed the airplane, not the man. I lagged a little behind and rejoined his tail. Somehow the American gathered the rest of his strength, and the Wildcat jerked upward, trying to perform a loop, but not in time. His nose was just beginning to rise. I took careful aim at the engine and slightly touched the throttle. Flames and smoke billowed from under the hood of the Wildcat. The fighter flipped over, and the pilot flew out of the cockpit. Far below me, almost directly over the shore of Guadalcanal, his parachute opened. The pilot didn't try to pull up the slings, he just hung there like a sack. That was the last time I saw him being carried toward the shore. The other 3 O's quickly attached themselves to my plane. Yonekawa smiled broadly at me as he took his proper wingman's seat. We gained altitude and headed back towards the island, looking for other enemy planes. Anti-aircraft shells began to burst around us. The Americans were aiming poorly, but the fact that there were already heavy anti-aircraft guns on the shore was alarming. After all, this was only a few hours after the start of the landing. I knew that it takes our troops more than 3 days after capturing a beachhead to move anti-aircraft artillery ashore. The speed with which the Americans unloaded equipment was astounding. Lieutenant Commander Nishizawa later told me what happened that day to the other 14 Zeros. Enemy carrier-based fighters were constantly barraging over Guadalcanal. They were dive-bombing in groups of 6 and 12 planes, and always from the sun. This forced the Zero to break formation. Never before had Nakajima and his pilots met such determined resistance and faced an enemy that showed such persistence. Each time while diving, the Wildcats strafed the Japanese planes and went down in a rollover, refusing to accept a fight in which the Zeros could take advantage of their incomparable maneuverability. Such tactics were very clever, but the Americans' aim was simply abysmal. In a whole day of constant attacks, they managed to shoot down only 1 Zero. It was a day of celebration for Nishizawa. Before he ran out of ammunition, this amazing ace, with the help of incredible maneuvers, which his wingman did not even try to repeat, managed to shoot down 6 American fighters. On this day, Nakajima first encountered enemy fighters operating in pairs. 2 Wildcat attacked his Zero. He had no trouble dodging them, but never once got a chance to fire on the Wildcat, as a second American invariably appeared nearby. Nakajima was literally seething with anger when he returned to Rabaul. He was forced to dive and run away to save his own skin. Nishizawa and I were the only 2 pilots to score victories that day. Meanwhile, I returned to 7,000 feet with 3 fighters behind me. We flew through tearing clouds and couldn't spot a single enemy airplane. But when we popped out of another cloud, for the first time in my combat career, an enemy airplane managed to take me by surprise. I heard a resounding thump, the snap of bullets, and a 2-inch hole appeared in the left lantern glass. The bullet had travelled only an inch from my head. I still didn't see any airplanes in the air. It could have even been anti-aircraft fire from the ground. But then I noticed the silhouette of an enemy bomber, which suddenly fired on my plane. Dauntless lay on the wing and rushed to the nearest cloud for cover. The pilot's courage was astounding. He had deliberately attacked 4 Zeros in a slow-moving, lightly armed dive bomber. The next second I was on his tail. Dauntless jerked up and down several times, then suddenly dove into the cloud. I followed it. For a few seconds I saw nothing, only a white cloying mass. Then the sky suddenly cleared. I quickly converged and opened fire. The tail gunner splashed his arms and fell back on his machine gun. I took the handle lightly and the shells hit the motor. The SBD flipped to the left a few times and then snapped into a haphazard dive. Yonekawa saw the pilot jump out with his parachute. It was my 60th victory. Back at 13,000 feet, we started looking for our group, but couldn't see them. A few minutes later, over the coast of Guadalcanal a few miles away, I made out a group of airplanes. It soon became apparent that they were 8 airplanes flying in 2 links. Enemy. Our airplanes had never used such a formation. I broke away from my comrades and quickly went to approach the enemy. I attack those planes on the right, leaving the others to my wingmen. The enemy has closed formation. Excellent. They looked like wildcats, and the fact that they are closing means they can't see me. If they continue on the same course, I can suddenly attack them from behind and below. A few more seconds. I can shoot down at least 2 planes on the first approach. I got as close as I could. The distance was rapidly decreasing. 200 yards, 100 yards, 70 yards, 60 yards. And I was trapped. The enemy planes turned out to be bombers, not fighters. They were the new Avenger torpedo bombers, which I'd never seen before. From the rear they looked a lot like Wildcats, but now I noticed that they were much larger, had an upper turret, and a lower firing point with the same 12.7mm machine gun. Not surprisingly, they were closing in formation. They were waiting for me, and now I would be the one in the crosshairs of 8 heavy machine guns if I turned right. If I turn left, it's the same thing. My engine was running on afterburner, so I couldn't go down fast enough. The way back was also closed. If I tried to do a flip, the enemy gunners would sweat the defenseless belly of my Zero. I had no chance of evading their fire. There was only one thing I could do: fly forward and fire all the guns and machine guns. I determinedly pressed the throttles. Almost at the same moment, all the American machine guns opened fire. The crackling of the machine guns and the coughing of the cannons overrode the other sounds. The enemy planes were only 20 yards in front of me when 2 bombers burst into flames. That was all I had time to see. A terrible explosion shook my body. I felt as if knives had been mercilessly thrust into my ears. The world exploded in scarlet flames and I was blinded. The 3 pilots following me later reported to the commander that they had seen a burning Avenger falling into the sea next to my plane. They also added that a tail of fire and smoke showed behind the second enemy airplane. So I was officially credited with my 61st and 62nd victories. But official US documents deny the loss in this Battle of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo carriers operating from 3 aircraft carriers maneuvering southwest of Guadalcanal. Probably those 2 airplanes did manage to get back to their ships after all. As my plane tumbled down and I passed out of the cockpit, the 3 O's followed me. They only stopped chasing when my fighter disappeared in a low cloud. It must have been several seconds before consciousness returned to me. A strong, cold wind blowing through the cracked windshield brought me back to my senses, but I was still out of control. Everything was flickering and flashing. Waves of blackness came over me. They slammed into me every time I tried to sit up straight. My head fell back against the back of the chair. I tried to see something, but the cabin danced and swayed before my eyes. It seemed to me that the lantern was tilted. In fact, the glass was just broken and the wind whipped across my face, squeezing out my tears as my glasses were also broken. I felt nothing but a pleasant, quiet drowsiness. I tried to determine where I'd been shot, whether I was in danger of dying, but none of that frightened me. If I die like this without any pain, I have nothing to regret. I was immersed in a ghostly world. I didn't want to think about anything. But suddenly my mother's face floated in front of me with amazing clarity. She was screaming shame. Shame. Wake up, Sabora, wake up. You're acting like a girl. You're not a coward. Get up. Gradually I realized what had happened. The Zero was rocketing toward the ground. I forced my eyes open and saw a bright red curtain. It seemed to me that the airplane was on fire. But I didn't smell smoke. I was still not thinking straight. I blinked several times. What was wrong? Each time red flashes. Seeing nothing, I stared at my own palm. The control knob. I squeeze it. Still unable to distinguish anything, I pulled the knob back. Gently. The airplane began to emerge from the chaotic corkscrew. I felt the overload pressing me into the seat as the Zero stopped diving and went into what could only be described as horizontal flight. The flow of wind had eased. It was no longer hitting me in the face with the same force. Suddenly a wild panic seized me. I could go blind. Then I would never return to Rabaul. I acted purely on instinct. I reached forward with my left hand, trying to find the throttle and increase the engine's power. I tensed, but my hand refused to obey. Nothing. In desperation, I tried to squeeze my fingers. No sensation. My hand was gone. I tried to wiggle the pedals with my feet. Only my right foot moved, and the Zero obediently slid sideways as I pushed down on the pedal. I clenched my teeth and tensed. Again, no sensation. I couldn't feel anything. The entire left side of my body seemed paralyzed. For several minutes I tried to move my left arm or leg. It was impossible. But I didn't feel any pain. This I could no longer understand. I'm wounded, seriously wounded. But I don't feel anything. I would have been glad if my left arm and leg had ached. letting me know that my nerves were all right. My cheeks were wet. I cried, tears streaming down my face. And it helped. Oh, it helped. The crust began to dissolve. The tears washed some of the blood from my eyes. But I still couldn't hear anything. But I could see again. Just a little, but the red veil began to fade. The sun illuminating the cabin helped me to distinguish the outline of the metal racks. In front of me a dim spot protruded the sight. My vision returned, and soon I could see the circles of the instruments. They remained blurred, though I could see them, but it was impossible to distinguish the hands. I turned my head and looked over the side of the cockpit. Huge black shadows were flying at great speed behind the wings. They could have been enemy ships, but in that case I was flying no more than 300 feet above the water. Then my hearing came back to me. First I heard the rumble of an engine, and then a sharp, jerky crackle. The ships were firing at me. The Zero was thrown up by the burst of an anti-aircraft shell. Strangely enough, I didn't do anything. I just sat in the cockpit, not even trying to dodge the fire. But the sound of bursts was quickly left behind. I could no longer see the black silhouettes on the water. They couldn't reach me anymore. A few more minutes passed. I sat motionless and struggled to make sense of it. My thoughts were scattered. I wanted to sleep again. I realized through my half-slumber that I would never make it back to Rabaul. I'd never get anywhere, not even to Buka Island, which is only 300 miles away. For a couple of minutes I thought that the best way out would be to dive into the sea at full speed. But I was a complete fool. I tried to force myself to wake up. I began to berate myself this is not the right way to die. If I was to die, I decided I should do it like a man. Am I an inexperienced novice who doesn't know how to fight? My consciousness cleared and fogged up again, but I knew that as long as I could fly the airplane, as long as I could fly, I would do everything in my power to carry off another enemy. It was a foolish thing to do. But I decided that I shouldn't save another enemy pilot by accepting the inevitable and just crashing into the water. I knew the great importance of aerial victories to pilots. If I am destined to die, why not in combat? Why should I die alone and unnoticed? After all, no one will hear the splash and the explosion. I couldn't think straight yet. Where are the fighters? I began to berate the wildcats for not wanting to show up. I shouted, "Come. I'm here. Come and fight." For several minutes I thrashed about in the cabin like a madman. Little by little, my mind came back to me. I realized the stupidity and senselessness of my actions. Only now I realized that I had survived only by sheer luck. I had survived many serious trials before, but none could even come close to equaling this one. Bullets had come within inches of my head. A few had clawed at my arms, tearing the skin off, but that was the end of it. What happened to me today? I still had a chance to survive. Why give it up? Suddenly I wanted to live. I wanted to get to Rabaul. First of all, I needed to check my wounds. I didn't know where I was hit, or how serious they were. Confidence came back to me, and I began to think and act reasonably. But I still couldn't move my left arm. I waved my right hand in the air, dropping the glove. With my fingers I felt around my head, fearfully waiting to see what I would find there. First I fumbled for the helmet, wet and sticky. I knew it was blood. Then I fumbled for a cut right on top of the helmet. It was deep, and it was filled with blood. I gently slipped my fingers in there and felt it. How deep was it? My fingers met something hard. I was afraid to admit the truth. My fingers went quite deep, clearly deeper than the helmet. That something hard could only be my bullet-riddled skull. Maybe it was even cracked. Thinking was painful. Bullets could have grazed the brain, though not too deeply. Everything I'd once read about combat injuries came to mind. The brain doesn't feel pain, but it was the bullets that could have caused paralysis on the left side of my body. All these thoughts crawled in my head, somehow sluggish and lazy. And in general, how can one sit in the broken cockpit of a damaged fighter, half-blinded, half-paralyzed, and stick one's fingers into a hole in one's own skull, and still perceive the surrounding objectively? I realized what had happened. I found a bloody wound on my head, but I never realized its seriousness. I knew it was there, that's all. Then I ran my fingers over his face. It was soft and swollen. I felt tears on my cheeks, maybe pieces of metal. But I'm not sure. There was blood everywhere, though, and I found several cuts on my cheeks. The Zero continued to fly, its engine humming smoothly. My head continued to clear. I was acting more and more consciously. I took a whiff. No smell of gasoline. That meant that neither the motor nor the fuel tanks were damaged. That was the first joyous discovery after the battle. With intact tanks and a serviceable engine, a fighter could fly a very long distance. But as his mind cleared, the wind blew harder and harder. It pressed my head against the seat. I leaned forward, blinking. The windshield had just disappeared. No wonder the wind seemed so strong, since it was blowing into the cockpit at 200 mph. I felt the blood on my face dry up, but the top of my head was still damp, and the wind was getting into a deep crack in my skull that was starting to bleed again. If I didn't plug that wound with something, I would soon pass out again, but now from blood loss. Suddenly a pain shot through me. My right eye. It began to throb, and the pain gradually intensified. I touched it with my fingers, but I pulled them away. The pain became unbearable. I put my right hand on my eye again, but the field of vision remained the same. I was blind in one eye. Every Japanese pilot carries 4 triangular bandages in the pockets of his flight suit. I pulled one out and tried to moisten it with saliva by spitting on one of the ends. But there was absolutely no saliva in my mouth. I was thirsty. My mouth was as dry as the desert. I continued to spit and chew, the end of the bandage softening little by little. I leaned forward as much as I could to get out of the wind and wiped my left eye with the wet bandage. He saw. Little by little my vision improved, and in less than a minute I could make out the wing consoles. I breathed a sigh of relief. But only for a second. As soon as I straightened up, I felt a deafening pain in my head, then another. The pain came in waves. At times I felt nothing, as if I'd been hit in the head with a giant sledgehammer. I wasted no time and tried to tape the wound on my head, but as soon as I took my hand away, the wind tore the bandage off and blew it away. Despair swept over me. How will I be able to wrap the bandage around my head? I must stop the bleeding. My left arm was inoperative, and I could only apply the bandage with my right, but my right hand was needed to hold the control stick and operate the throttle. The wind whistling in the cockpit made it even more difficult. I pulled out the second blindfold, but as soon as I placed it on my knee, it blew away. The third and fourth followed. What could I do? I was almost desperate. The pain in my head had gotten worse. It was now pulsing somewhere deep inside my skull, and each new wave was stronger than the last. I was still wearing the silk scarf wrapped around my neck. I untied the knot and tucked the end of the scarf under my arm to hold it up with my weight. Then I pulled out a folding knife and opened it with my teeth. The scarf fluttered frantically in the wind. I took the knife in my right hand and clamped the end of the scarf in my teeth to cut off a piece, but the wind carried it away. Again I cut the scarf, and again the shrieking wind carried the fabric away from the cabin. I just didn't know what to do. Again the despair set in. I tried to think of something. I had the last shred of scarf left. Of course. How I hadn't thought of that in the first place. I leaned forward to get out of the wind and started to tuck the scarf under my flight helmet, trying to cover the wound. But I had to straighten up. The more I stayed in the bent position, the worse the pain became. Finally, I clutched the control knob with my knees and began to steer the airplane in this strange way. I then bent forward and pushed the throttle sector forward, as far as it would go, holding it in that position. I then pulled the knob back with my feet, forcing the Zero to start climbing. I wasn't too concerned about how accurately I was flying or how long I could control the airplane. At 1,500 feet, I dropped the throttle and went into level flight. I then pushed the seat cushion down to be as low as possible, and thus at least partially sheltered from the wind. Firmly gripping the control stick with my feet to keep the airplane on course, I braced the cushion with my shoulder to use it as a wind deflector. Bit by bit, I managed to stuff the scarf deeper under my helmet and press it against the wound. I have no idea how long it took me, but it seemed like an eternity. I couldn't see yet, and the Zero immediately jerked frantically and dropped onto the wing in such a way that I was thrown upward. If the plane loses control, I'm dead. I shouldn't touch the rudder pedals at all. Finally, I completed the dressing. The scarf was stuffed under my helmet and pressed tightly against the wound. I crawled back into the seat and quickly straightened the fighter. My heart immediately felt better. The bleeding had stopped. And I couldn't help the relaxed feeling of peace after the incredible tension had worn off. Soon I was overcome by an unbearable urge to sleep. I fought desperately, but I couldn't shake off the drowsiness. More than once I began to doze off with my chin resting on my chest. I shook my head, hoping the pain would force me awake. But every half-minute my shoulders twitched as I hung from the restraining straps. More than once, when I came to, it turned out that the Zero was flying upside down. At one such moment I was so stiff I couldn't straighten it out. A few seconds later the engine coughed alarmingly. It was enough to make me come to my senses. With a sharp jerk of the handle, I brought the airplane back to normal. Sleep. Shake your head. Quiet and quiet. The wonderful, warm, cozy embrace of sleep. Everything is so peaceful. Wake up. Wake up. I was literally screaming. Wake up. I woke up when the Zero veered steeply to the right, going on the wing. I must stay awake. How? How do I overcome the unbearable urge to sleep, to forget everything and sink into the wonderful world of slumber? It's so nice, so warm, so cozy. The fighter suddenly jerked. I was flying belly up again. Don't sleep. Slowly I began to feel angry that I couldn't resist the urge to sleep. I took my palm off the control stick and whipped my cheek as hard as I could. 1, 2, 3. I hoped the concussion would bring me back to consciousness. But it couldn't go on like this indefinitely. Soon I felt a salty taste in my mouth. Blood appeared on my lips and ran down my chin. My cheeks swelled even more and began to burn. I felt as if a rubber balloon had been shoved into my mouth and inflated. But there was no choice. I had to beat myself up if I didn't want to sleep. Maybe food would help me beat the sleepiness. I took the ration box and swallowed a few pieces of dried fish. I still felt sleepy. Then I ate some more, but now I chewed them thoroughly. Instantly I felt very sick. The airplane lost control and I began to squirm in fits of vomiting. Everything I had swallowed spewed back out onto my legs and the control panel. I was almost losing my mind from the intolerable pain in my head. But even this attack didn't help me awaken. Again and again I beat my fist on my cheek until it lost sensitivity. In desperation I slapped my hand on my wounded head, but it was in vain. I wanted to sleep, only sleep, to forget everything in the world, knowing that sleep would be eternal. Delicious, warm sleep. The Zero rocked and jerked. No matter what I did, I couldn't keep it level. I thought I was holding the handle straight, but I involuntarily jerked it to the left or right, making the plane go into wild turns. I was ready to give up. I knew I couldn't take it anymore, but I swore I would never act like a coward. I can't point the plane into the ocean and disappear in a blinding flash. If I am to die, I must do it like a samurai. I must take a few enemies with me. A ship. I need an enemy ship. Falling into hopeless despair, I turned the Zero around and headed back toward Guadalcanal. But after a few minutes, my head cleared. No drowsiness, no deafening pain. I couldn't understand why. Why would I seek death when I could fly to Buca or even Rabaul? I turned the fighter around again and headed north. But after a few more minutes, the urge to sleep overcame me again. I was like a drunk. Everything seemed to be spinning around me. What am I doing heading north? An enemy ship. I remembered. I have to find the enemy ship and ram it. Slam into it at full speed. Kill as many enemies as I can. The world went foggy. Everything melted into a grey haze. I must have turned toward Guadalcanal 5 times and set course for Rabaul the same number of times. I began to yell at myself. I was determined to force myself awake. I screamed and squealed. No sleep. Gradually the urge to sleep waned. I was on my way back to Rabaul. But flying just north didn't guarantee that I would get to my base. I had no idea where I was. All I knew was that I was flying in the direction of Rabaul. I was a considerable distance from Guadalcanal, but I didn't know exactly how far. I looked carefully out to sea, but didn't see any of the chain of islands that stretched all the way to Rabaul. Since I had only my right leg working and could only push the right pedal, it was likely that I had been driven east of the Solomon Islands. I pulled an ocean map out from under the seat. It reeked of blood, and I had to spend a few minutes turning it around and scrubbing the blood off on my flight suit. But it didn't help much. I tried to orient myself by the position of the sun. 30 minutes passed, but no island appeared. Where had I gone wrong? Where had I gone wrong? The sky was perfectly clear, and the ocean stretched all the way to the horizon. But suddenly I jumped up on the seat. Or was I just flying down? Everything seemed so strange. It turned out that I had flipped upside down again, and didn't realize it until the harness straps crashed into my shoulders. Something glinted under the wings. What could it have been? I looked down. Something dark glittered there again, located literally underneath the fighter itself. Water. I almost fell into the water. In a panic, I leaned forward and moved the throttle sector, pulling the handle toward me at the same time. The Zero obediently took off at 1,500 feet. I moved the throttle back to minimum cruising speed. The island. There's an island right ahead. It appeared on the horizon, peeking out of the water. I laughed out loud with happiness. Everything will be all right now. I'll determine my position and set a precise course for Rabaul. I whirled around nervously, trying to see the shoreline. But the island never appeared. Where had it gone? Or is it just a hallucination? What's happening to me? The island slowly floated to the right, turning into a low cloud. I tried again to see the compass. It was still kind of blurry. I spit on my palm and wiped my left eye. Still, I could only see the circle of the cartouche. I leaned forward as hard as I could and literally jammed my nose into the glass. Finally, I recognized the arrow. I was flying a heading of 330 degrees. No wonder I hadn't seen any islands for almost 2 hours. The Zero was heading straight for the center of the Pacific. I pulled out the map again and estimated that I was about 60 miles northeast of the Solomon Islands. It was only a guess, but I didn't have anything better. I turned at right angles to the left and flew to where I guessed New Ireland should be. This island was just to the northeast of New Britain and Rabaul. Again and again waves of drowsiness came over me. I had lost count of the number of times the airplane had gone down on its wing, and the number of times I had to bring the Zero back to normal. I stared at the sky, bent over frequently to check the compass, and jerked the control stick until I was on a course that I hoped would lead to New Ireland. The headache got worse and helped keep me awake. Then I suddenly experienced a terrible shock. Quite suddenly the motor stood up. There was a strange whistling sound of wind rushing into the cabin. Instinctively I pushed the handle forward to gain altitude. In this way I prevented the airplane from corkscrewing and forced the propeller to spin at least under air pressure. I began to act with exceptional sagacity, which later surprised myself. The mind can work wonders in emergencies. Before I even had time to think about the reasons, I realized that the main fuel tank was empty. I had one more tank left, but I had to restore the gasoline supply almost immediately. Normally I had no problem switching the gasoline line valve with my left hand. But now that hand was paralyzed. I had only my right hand left. I tried to reach for the switch knob with it. It didn't work. I tensed up. And still my hand couldn't reach the opposite side of the cockpit. The Zero was gently descending toward the water. It glided down without a tremor, quietly. I jerked forward as hard as I could, and pulled the feed lever from the fuselage tank. But no fuel was flowing into the engine. The automatic pump that connected to the gasoline line was taking too long to pump air. I grabbed the handle of the auxiliary manual pump and worked it frantically. There wasn't much time left. Fortunately, the automatic pump came on immediately. The motor roared with satisfaction, and the Zero leapt forward. I didn't waste any time and returned to 1,500 feet again. Long months of training flights over water had come to the rescue. I set a fleet record for minimum fuel consumption. If I could continue to keep the minimum consumption, I estimated that the airplane would be able to stay in the air for about 1 hour and 45 minutes more. I adjusted the propeller pitch and set the throttle to 1700 RPM. I adjusted the fuel-air mixture so that the engine was running at its very limit. Any more, and it would stall. The Zero was going very slowly. I had less than 2 hours to reach the Japanese-occupied island, and less than 2 hours to live if I failed to do so. Another hour passed. The vast ocean and blue sky still loomed before my eyes. Suddenly I saw something on the water. An atoll. There was no mistake this time. It wasn't a cloud in front of the airplane. It is absolutely definitely an island. As I flew closer, I recognized its outline. Green Island. A horseshoe-shaped atoll that I had spotted on my way to Guadalcanal. I found the island on the map, and hope sprang to life again. I was only 60 miles from Rabaul. 60 miles. Normal, one small jump, but now my situation was anything but normal. I had fuel left for another 40 minutes of flight time. My Zero was badly damaged, the cockpit lantern shattered. The metal skin, riddled with bullets, created additional drag, noticeably reducing the speed of the airplane. I was severely wounded and still partially paralyzed. My right eye was completely blind, and my left eye didn't see too well either. I was exhausted and was expending all my strength to keep the airplane level. Another island just ahead. This time it wasn't clouds rising on the horizon. I recognized the mountains. This was New Ireland, no mistake. I knew that if I could get over the mountains, which reached an altitude of 2,400 feet, I would be right in front of Rabaul. It seemed to me that I was facing an endless series of obstacles on my way home. Thick clouds were billowing around the mountain peaks, heavy rain was pouring down on the mountains and the island. To break through it was impossible. I was exhausted physically and mentally, half blind, on a badly damaged fighter plane. How would I be able to get through a thunderstorm that was very dangerous even under normal conditions? I had no choice but to try to avoid it. It was a tough decision as the fuel gauge was dropping lower and lower. I had only minutes left. I pressed my lips together and turned south. The plane flew slowly over the St. George Strait between Rabaul and New Ireland. Suddenly 2 frothy streaks appeared under the wings. I soon made out 2 large warships, apparently heavy cruisers. They were heading south at full speed. They were making over 30 knots heading towards Guadalcanal. I almost jumped when I saw the Japanese ships. I had a terrible urge to land a fighter jet on the water right here and now. Then one of the cruisers would turn around and pick me up. My hopes quickly faded. The Rabaul bounced 1,000,000 miles away in an instant. I made a circle over the ships and prepared to descend for a water landing. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The cruisers were racing to join the battle for Guadalcanal. If they stop to pick me up, which is still not at all certain their guns will not appear in time where they are needed, waterboarding was out of the question. I turned back toward Rabaul. I had barely 20 minutes of fuel left. However, if I didn't make it to Rabaul, I could land on the shore. Then the familiar volcano appeared on the horizon. I did it. Rabaul was revealed. But I had yet to land. It seemed quite impossible because the left side of my body was paralyzed. I circled the airfield, unable to make up my mind, not even knowing what to do. I didn't know that I was reported missing, that all the other planes except the one shot down over Guadalcanal had gone down 2 hours earlier. LT. Sasai told me later that he couldn't believe his own eyes when he identified my Zero through binoculars. He shouted my name, and all the pilots rushed to the airfield. From the air, I couldn't see them with my damaged left eye. All I could see was a narrow strip. I decided to land on the water just off the shore after all. The Zero went down slowly. 8007, 004, 001, 00, and then I was only 50 feet above the water. But I changed my mind again. The vision of the airplane crash landing on the water and my injured head thrown forward at the jolt was too distinct. I regained altitude and returned to the runway. If I concentrated, I could manage, I could land. The fuel gauge arrow was almost at the restrictor. I set the propeller to the highest pitch, gave full throttle, and gained 1,500 feet. It was now or never. The Zero jumped down as I pushed the handle away from me. I released the landing gear, then the flaps. The airplane's speed plummeted. I saw a long line of fighter jets parked along the runway rushing toward me. I mustn't crash into them. Bring him back. I was too far to the left and I ripped the handle to get off on another approach. After 4 circles over the airfield, I decided to make another attempt to land. When I reached the glide path, I lifted my right foot and turned off the ignition with the edge of my boot. Even if there was even a drop of gasoline left in the Zero's tanks, it would explode in a crash. The coconut palms at the edge of the airfield appeared before my eyes. I skimmed over them, trying to gauge my altitude from the trees. Now, I was directly above the runway. A heavy thump followed as the Zero touched the ground. I piled on the handle and pressed down hard to keep the airplane from skidding. The Zero rolled toward the command center. I tried to smile, but the wave of darkness swept over me again. I felt like I was falling somewhere, falling into a bottomless abyss. Everything around me was spinning frantically. Somewhere in the distance I heard voices shouting my name. They were shouting Sakai. Sakai. I cursed to myself. Why can't they keep their yelling down? After all, I want to sleep. The blackness lifted. I opened my eyes and saw the faces of those gathered around me. Am I dreaming or am I really back in Rabaul? I didn't know. Everything seemed somehow unreal. I decided that I was dreaming. It can't be true. Everything would melt away in the dark. I tried to get up. I grabbed the side of the cabin and pulled myself up. This really is Rabaul. This isn't a dream, damn it. And then I collapsed, completely helpless. Strong arms picked me up and pulled me out of the airplane. I had nothing else to worry about.